Most American presidents are remembered as marble statues, dignified, distant, and composed. John Quincy Adams was different. He swam naked in the Potomac River every morning to numb his nerves. He housed a live alligator in the East Room and entertained theories that mole people lived inside the earth. This was not merely eccentricity. It was the unraveling of the most brilliant, tortured mind to ever hold the office. Welcome to the strange, naked reality of the most eccentric president in history. February 1778. The Atlantic Ocean is a graveyard waiting to happen. A small leaking frigate called the Boston is being hunted by 3 British warships. The captain orders the cannons loaded. He prepares to fight to the death. In the cabin below, a man hands a musket to his 10-year-old son and tells him to be ready to die for a country that barely exists. The boy neither cried nor panicked. He clutches the weapon and waits for the end. Far from a scene in an adventure novel, this was the brutal reality of John Quincy Adams's childhood. While other boys were playing with marbles or learning to farm, he was being prepared for martyrdom. He survived that voyage, but in many ways, the boy died on that boat. What stepped off the gangplank in France was less a child than a weapon forged by 2 of the most terrifying parents in American history, John and Abigail Adams. We often view the founding fathers as marble statues, but we rarely ask what it was like to be their property. John Quincy was an experiment. His parents sought a legacy rather than a mere son. They wanted a titan, and to build a titan, they had to systematically dismantle a human being. That sentence became the fuel for John Quincy's life. Abigail Adams, often deified as a nurturing mother, wrote letters to her young son that read like military orders. She inquired only of his usefulness, never his happiness. When he was still small enough to sit in her lap, she sent him a letter that would haunt him for 80 years. I would rather see you dead than a disgrace to your country. The violence of that sentence is unmistakable. It was a message that his life had no intrinsic value unless it served the state. Terror, rather than ambition, became the engine of John Quincy Adams. The terror of being ordinary, the terror of being unloved. By age 12, the programming was complete. His diary from 1779 is not a record of youth. It is a ledger of self-hatred. He cataloged his wasted minutes. He punished himself for sleeping past dawn. He wrote, I am determined that as long as I shall be able to get my own living in an honorable manner, I will depend upon no one. This is the voice of a middle-aged accountant trapped in the body of a prepubescent boy. While his peers in Massachusetts were learning to flirt or ride horses, John Quincy was in Paris, analyzing the decay of the French aristocracy. He dined with Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, listening to them dissect the corpse of the British Empire. He saw the world as a chessboard before he had even gone through puberty. Then came the exile. At 14, he was sent to Russia, alone. He traveled from the salons of Paris to the freezing golden court of Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg. He was there to serve as a translator for the American envoy, Francis Dana. A 14-year-old boy stood shivering in the St. Petersburg winter, fluent in French, debating diplomats who were 3 times his age. He was the smartest person in every room he entered, and he was completely, devastatingly alone. It was here, in the silence of the Russian snow, that the ice entered his soul. He learned that intimacy was dangerous. He learned that allies were temporary. He built a fortress inside his own mind, stocking it with books, languages, and rigid moral codes. He calcified. When he finally returned to America to attend Harvard, he was an alien species. He walked the campus in Cambridge like a visitor from another planet. He found his classmates childish, their concerns trivial. He was arrogant, yes, but it was the arrogance of a veteran surrounded by recruits who had never seen combat. But even a machine has a breaking point. Even John Quincy Adams had a heart. Her name was Mary Fraser. He met her in Newburyport shortly after law school. She was vibrant, she was real, and for the first time in his life, the fog of duty lifted. He fell in love. He wrote poetry, terrible, passionate poetry. He smiled. He began to imagine a life that didn't involve treaties or wars. He planned to propose. He planned to be just a man. The reaction from his family was immediate and brutal. Abigail Adams intervened with the precision of a sniper. She did not attack the girl. She attacked his conscience. She told him that early marriage was the gravesite of ambition. She told him that he did not belong to himself. He belonged to history. His father, the vice president, joined the chorus. They demanded he sacrifice his happiness on the altar of his potential. A rebel would have eloped. A selfish man would have chosen love. John Quincy Adams did neither. He obeyed. He broke off the engagement. He crushed the only spark of pure joy he had ever known because his mother told him it was necessary. It was a psychological amputation. He would eventually marry Louisa Catherine Johnson, but it was a union of duty, not the wild, unscripted passion he felt for Mary. He retreated into work. He wrote brilliant essays. He buried the pain under layers of logic and legal briefs. He tried to settle down as a quiet lawyer in Boston, hoping to escape the crushing gravity of his last name. But the machine was already in motion. In 1794, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. President George Washington had appointed him minister to the Netherlands. He hadn't asked for the job. He didn't want the job. But you do not say no to George Washington, and you certainly do not say no to John Adams. The trap snapped shut. The brief window of escape was gone. The boy who wanted to be a lawyer was dead. In his place stood the diplomat, cold, brilliant, and utterly detached. He packed his trunks. He boarded the ship. He sailed back toward the old world, a perfect instrument of state, carrying a broken heart that he would never, ever show to the public again. By 1794, John Quincy found himself in The Hague, Netherlands. Europe was a powder keg. The French Revolution has exploded, sending shock waves of terror and ideology across the continent. Guillotines are rising in Paris, and armies are marching across borders. Into this chaos walks a 27-year-old American named John Quincy Adams. He carries the title of minister resident, but in truth he is a spy, a scholar, and a ghost. While his diplomatic peers spend their nights in gambling dens and brothels, drowning in the hedonism of a dying aristocracy, Adams sits alone in a drafty room. He reads, he writes, he dissects the political rotting carcass of Europe with the precision of a surgeon. He is the watchman of the United States. He realizes earlier than anyone else that the United States must not touch this fire. If the young republic gets involved in Europe's wars, it will burn. This isolationist philosophy, born in the lonely candlelit nights of The Hague, will one day become the bedrock of American foreign policy. But the cost of this insight is his humanity. He is becoming a creature of ink and paper, observing life rather than living it. It is during a brief stopover in London in 1797 that the machine encounters a glitch. Her name is Louisa Catherine Johnson. She is the daughter of the American consul in London, but she is thoroughly European, raised in Nantes, educated in England. She plays the harp, she sings, She possesses a delicate, fragile grace that is entirely alien to the rock-ribbed Puritanism of the Adams family. John Quincy is drawn to her, perhaps because she represents everything he is not: lightness, art, social ease. He courts her, but even his courtship is a heavy, ponderous thing, filled with lectures on self-improvement rather than whispers of affection. They marry on July 26, 1797. It should be a joyous union, the merging of two diplomatic families. Instead, it is the beginning of a 50-year tragedy. John Quincy does not realize that by marrying Louisa, he is bringing a tropical bird into a New England winter. He expects her to be like his mother, Abigail, steel-spined, frugal, politically astute. Louisa is none of those things. She is sensitive, sickly, and prone to fainting spells. From the very first week of their marriage, John Quincy begins to mold her, criticizing her spending, correcting her behavior, trying to turn her into an Adams. He does not see that he is slowly crushing her spirit, just as his parents crushed his. Their first test comes not in a ballroom, but in a carriage. Adams is reassigned to Berlin, to the court of Prussia. He drags his pregnant wife across the scarred landscape of Europe in the dead of winter. The carriage wheels shatter on frozen ruts. Louisa is terrified, ill, and miserable. John Quincy is stoic. He treats the journey as a logistical problem to be solved, not a human ordeal to be endured. When they arrive in Berlin, he throws himself into his work. He negotiates a treaty of amity and commerce with Prussia, a masterstroke that opens trade routes for American merchants. But his greatest work in Berlin is not the treaty, it is his observation. He travels to Silesia, inspecting factories and mines. He writes letters back home that are so detailed, so prescient, that when they are published, they become a sensation. He predicts the rise of German industrial power. He sees the future of economics. He is becoming the architect, the man who understands the gears of the world. But at home in their cold Berlin apartment, Louisa is lonely, struggling with a husband who speaks more to his diary than to her. In 1801, the political winds shift. His father, John Adams, loses the presidency to Thomas Jefferson. The Adams dynasty is in disgrace. John Quincy is recalled. He returns to America, bringing his foreign wife and his infant son to a country that views him with suspicion. He tries to enter domestic politics. He is elected to the Senate in 1803. It is a disaster. He is too intellectual, too rigid, too Adams. He votes his conscience regardless of party lines, alienating the Federalists who elected him. He supports Jefferson's Embargo Act because he believes it is best for the nation, even though it destroys the economy of his home state of Massachusetts. He is branded a traitor by his own party. He is ostracized. He sits alone in the Senate chamber, a pariah. He resigns in disgrace in 1808. The lesson is reinforced. America does not want him. The only place he is valued is away. And so, in 1809, the exile begins again. President James Madison throws him a lifeline, or perhaps a sentence. He is appointed minister to Russia. It is the most prestigious and the most remote diplomatic post on earth, St. Petersburg, the edge of the civilized world. John Quincy makes a decision that is both practical and cruel. He takes Louisa and their youngest son, Charles, but he leaves his two older boys, George and John, back in Massachusetts to be educated. He separates a mother from her children. Louisa begs to take them. He refuses. The education of an Adams takes precedence over the heart of a mother. She boards the ship weeping. She will not see her sons for 6 years. Those 6 years will break her. St. Petersburg is a city of gilded palaces and frozen corpses. The Adams family arrives just as Napoleon is tearing Europe apart. The winters are brutal, the sun vanishing for months at a time. They have little money. The salary of an American minister is a pittance compared to the unimaginable wealth of the Russian nobility. They cannot afford to entertain. They live in a drafty house where the water freezes in the pitchers. Yet, in this freezer, John Quincy Adams achieves his greatest diplomatic seduction. He befriends Tsar Alexander I. It is an unlikely friendship, the absolute autocrat of all the Russias and the austere Republican from Massachusetts. But they bond over one thing: intellect. They walk together along the embankments of the Neva River. They discuss God, the Bible, and the destiny of nations. Adams convinces the Tsar to favor American trade over British trade. He drives a wedge between the great powers. He is playing three-dimensional chess while Washington is playing checkers. But inside the house, tragedy strikes. Louisa gives birth to a daughter named Louisa after her mother. For a year, the gloomy house is filled with a rare light. John Quincy, the cold father, is captivated by the baby girl. He softens. Then the Russian winter claims its toll. The baby sickens. She dies. The grief in the Adams household is a physical weight. Louisa enters a deep catatonic depression. She blames John Quincy for bringing them to this frozen hell. She blames him for leaving her other sons behind. And John Quincy, he does what he was trained to do. He locks the grief in a box. He buries the child in a foreign grave and goes back to work. He writes in his diary, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away." He uses faith as a shield to keep from feeling the agony. He cannot comfort his wife because he cannot access his own pain. The silence between them grows into a chasm. While the Adams family is freezing in Russia, the world catches fire. The War of 1812 breaks out between the United States and Great Britain. It is a stupid, avoidable, disastrous war. The British burn Washington, D.C. to the ground. The White House is a smoking ruin. The American economy collapses. The nation is on the verge of ceasing to exist. The British are triumphant. They hold vast swathes of American territory. They demand surrender. John Quincy Adams is summoned to Ghent, Belgium in 1814. His mission: negotiate a peace treaty with the British Empire. He is joined by 4 other American commissioners. Among them is Henry Clay of Kentucky. Had a human being been designed specifically to torture John Quincy Adams, the result would have been Henry Clay. Clay is a Westerner, a gambler, a drinker, a womanizer, a man of magnetic charm and loose morals. He plays cards until 4 a.m. He smokes cigars that choke the room. He mocks Adams's rigid schedule. Adams wakes up at 5 a.m. to read his Bible. Clay is just stumbling to bed. They despise each other. The tension in the American delegation is almost as high as the tension with the British. The negotiations at Ghent are a high-stakes poker game played with the fate of a nation. The British hold all the cards. They have won the battles. They demand an Indian buffer state in the Northwest. They demand control of the Great Lakes. They demand parts of Maine. They treat the Americans with icy contempt. Adams sits at the table, his eyes burning with lack of sleep, his face set in a grimace of defiance. He refuses to yield an inch. He fights over every word, every comma. He uses his massive intellect to tie the British negotiators in knots. But it is Henry Clay, the gambler, who understands the psychology of the bluff. Adams provides the legal arguments. Clay provides the swagger. The two men, who hate each other, form a terrifyingly effective team. They realize the British are tired of war. They realize the British treasury is empty after fighting Napoleon. They wait, they stall, they argue. December the 24th, 1814, Christmas Eve, the Treaty of Ghent is signed. Against all odds, against all logic, Adams and his team have secured a peace that gives away nothing. No territory lost, no rights surrendered. It is a miracle. Adams writes to his mother, "We have peace." He does not write about the shouting matches with Clay. He does not write about the despair he felt when the news of the burning of Washington arrived. He simply records the duty done. He has saved the Republic. He has proven that the pen can be mightier than the sword, provided the man holding the pen is stubborn enough to never put it down. After the treaty, Adams is sent to London as the minister to Great Britain. It is a victory lap. He is reunited with his two older sons, but the reunion is bittersweet. The boys are strangers to him. They are afraid of him. He quizzes them on their Latin and is disappointed. He does not hug them. He evaluates them. He is the architect of empire, but he is a stranger to his own blood. In London, he finalizes the commercial treaties that will bind the U.S. and U.K. economies together for the next century. He is at the peak of his powers. He is 50 years old. He is the most experienced, most intelligent, most capable diplomat in the Western world. In 1817, a letter arrives from the new president, James Monroe. Adams is summoned home. He is to be the Secretary of State. This is it, the stepping stone to the presidency, the position his father held, the destiny he was bred for. He boards the ship for America. He stands on the deck looking back at Europe. He has spent more of his adult life abroad than at home. He knows the courts of kings better than he knows the farms of Massachusetts. He is returning to a country that is surging with a new chaotic energy, the energy of the frontier, of Jacksonian democracy, of unwashed masses demanding a voice. Adams brings with him a vision of a great power, a continental empire governed by reason, science, and law. He does not realize that the country he is returning to doesn't care about reason. It cares about land, gold, and glory. The architect is coming home with the blueprints for a cathedral, but the people just want to build a saloon. As the coastline of America appears on the horizon, John Quincy Adams feels a familiar tightening in his chest. He is successful. He is respected. He is feared. But as he looks at his wife, Louisa, standing silently by the rail, her face a mask of enduring sadness, and at his sons who look at him with wary eyes, he knows the truth. He has conquered the world, but he has lost his home. The machine is operating at maximum efficiency, but the man inside is screaming in a room that no one can hear. He steps off the boat, ready to write the Monroe Doctrine, ready to expand the borders to the Pacific, ready to take the White House. He is ready to fail. In 1817, Washington City was a capital in name only. It is a swamp. It is a humid, mosquito-infested scar carved out of the Maryland wilderness, where pigs roam the unpaved avenues, and the skeletons of half-built government buildings loom like Roman ruins in a malaria fever dream. The British had burned it 3 years prior, and the soot still clings to the stones of the Capitol. It is a city of transient boarding houses, mud that swallows carriage wheels whole, and a social scene fueled by whiskey and ambition. Into this muddy purgatory steps John Quincy Adams. He is 50 years old. He has the resume of a king and the personality of a calculus textbook. He has returned from the courts of Europe to claim his birthright. He is the new Secretary of State. But the America he returns to is not the America he left. The era of good feelings is a lie. It is a veneer of one-party rule covering a cauldron of sectional hatred. The Federalists are dead, leaving only the Republicans, but the Republicans are eating themselves alive. The old guard of the Founding Fathers is dying off. Jefferson is an old man on a mountain. Adams Sr. is a relic in Quincy. A new generation of giants has risen, men who do not care about Latin or protocol. They care about power. And John Quincy Adams, the last Puritan, the man who measures his life in ink and duty, is about to walk into a buzzsaw. For 8 years under President James Monroe, Adams performs a miracle. He is, without question, the greatest Secretary of State in the history of the Republic. He does not just manage foreign policy, he creates it ex nihilo. He looks at the map of North America and sees what no one else sees: a continental empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. His first great act of aggression began with the transcontinental treaty with Spain. The Spanish Empire is crumbling, bleeding out from revolutions in South America. Florida is a festering wound on the American border, a haven for runaway slaves and hostile Seminoles. The political class in Washington wants war. Adams wants the land, but he wants it on his terms. He sits across from the Spanish minister, Luis de Onís. Onís is a seasoned diplomat, but Adams is a force of nature. For months, they lock horns. Adams bullies lectures and wears the Spaniard down with an avalanche of legal precedents and historical claims. He doesn't just want Florida. He wants a border that reaches the Pacific Ocean. He draws a line across the map that gives the United States a claim to Oregon. It is a breathtaking act of geopolitical theft, executed with a quill pen. He secures the future of the American West before most Americans have even crossed the Mississippi. Then comes the Monroe Doctrine. It bears the president's name, but make no mistake, the ink is Adams. In 1823, the Holy Alliance of Europe, Russia, Prussia, Austria, is eyeing the newly independent nations of South America. They want to restore the colonies. The British propose a joint alliance with the U.S. to stop them. Everyone in Monroe's cabinet, including Jefferson and Madison from the sidelines, says, yes, join the British. Be safe. Adams stands alone. He stands in the cabinet room, short, bald, his eyes watering from the strain, and tells the President of the United States that they are wrong. He utters a phrase that should be carved into the granite of American history. It would be more candid as well as more dignified to avow our principles explicitly to Russia and France than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war. He refuses to be a junior partner. He demands that the United States declare the Western Hemisphere off limits to European colonization. It is an act of supreme arrogance. The U.S. Navy is a joke compared to the Royal Navy. The U.S. Army is a militia, but Adams bets everything on the power of the bluff. He writes the speech. Monroe reads it. Europe blinks. The United States, a second-rate agrarian republic, has just drawn a line in the Atlantic Ocean and told the old world to stay on its side. It is the zenith of his career. He is the wolf of the State Department. But while Adams is conquering the world, he is losing the room. To be president, you must be liked. And John Quincy Adams is impossible to like. He is an iceberg, as one contemporary called him. He holds parties because he must, but they are excruciating affairs. He stands by the fireplace, stiff, silent, judging the conversation of his guests. He has no small talk. If you ask him about the weather, he might give you a lecture on meteorology. If you ask him about his family, he freezes. He is a man who loves humanity in the abstract, but cannot stand people in the concrete. His wife, Louisa, is the charm of the operation. She plays the harp. She smiles, she flirts in French, she covers for his social autism. But she is crumbling. The pressure of Washington society, the constant criticism of her foreign ways is driving her into deep bouts of depression. She faints at parties. She spends days in bed. Adams records her illnesses in his diary with clinical detachment, noting the symptoms, but failing to understand the cause. He is a man who can read the Tsar of Russia, but cannot read his own wife. And now the sharks begin to circle. The election of 1824 is approaching. It is the end of the line for Monroe. The throne is empty, and there are 4 men who believe they are the anointed one. First, William Crawford of Georgia, the Secretary of the Treasury, the machine politician. He is the favorite of the old guard, the heir apparent of the Virginia dynasty. He is a giant of a man, handsome, affable, and utterly ruthless. But fate intervenes. In 1823, a stroke leaves him paralyzed, blind, and barely able to speak. His doctors bleed him until he is a ghost. He lies in a darkened room, a broken titan, yet his supporters refuse to let him drop out. He is the King Caucus candidate, a dead man walking. Second, Henry Clay of Kentucky, the Speaker of the House. Harry of the West, the gambler. Clay is everything Adams is not. He is magnetic, charming, a hard drinker, a reckless speculator. He commands the House of Representatives like a conductor leads an orchestra. He has a vision of the American system, roads, canals, tariffs, that mirrors Adams' own, but he sells it with a smile, not a lecture. Adams respects his mind but despises his morals. Clay plays cards until dawn. Adams wakes at dawn to read the Bible. They are oil and water. Third, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the Secretary of War. Young, brilliant, intense as a burning coal. He is the intellectual rival, the man whose mind is as sharp and dangerous as Adams. But he sees the writing on the wall. He drops out of the presidential race to secure the vice presidency, waiting like a vulture for the next cycle. And fourth, the monster, the hero, Andrew Jackson. General Jackson is not supposed to be here. He is a military man, not a statesman. He is the hero of New Orleans, the man who slaughtered the British. He is a duelist who carries a bullet in his chest from a fight. He has executed men for desertion. He has invaded Florida without orders, an act Adams defended, ironically, saving Jackson's career. To the establishment in Washington, Jackson is an American Napoleon, a dangerous populist who will rule by the sword. To the people, the new voters, the unwashed masses in the West and South, he is a god. He is the fist of the common man, raised against the corrupt elites in Washington. Adams looks at Jackson and sees the end of the Republic. Jackson looks at Adams and sees a monarchist snob. The campaign is a dirty, vicious brawl. There are no primaries, no conventions, just rumors, pamphlets, and backroom deals. Adams refuses to campaign. His code of honor forbids it. The office must seek the man, not the man, the office, he says. He sits at his desk in the State Department, working 18 hours a day, refusing to ask for a single vote, believing that his record will speak for itself. It is a noble, suicidal strategy. When the votes were counted in November 1824, the result was a political train wreck. Andrew Jackson, 99 electoral votes. John Quincy Adams, 84 electoral votes. William Crawford, 41 electoral votes. Henry Clay, 37 electoral votes. Jackson has the most popular votes. He has the most electoral votes, but he does not have the majority. The Constitution, that cold mathematical machine, grinds into gear. The 12th Amendment kicks in. The election is thrown to the House of Representatives. The rules are specific. The House must choose from the top 3 candidates: Jackson, Adams, Crawford. Henry Clay, coming in fourth, is eliminated. This is the moment, the pivot point of history. Henry Clay, the man who wanted to be president more than he wanted to breathe, is out. but he is still the Speaker of the House. He controls the votes. He is the kingmaker. Whoever Henry Clay supports will become the 6th President of the United States. For 1 month, Washington, D.C. becomes a pressure cooker. The air is thick with conspiracy. Clay is courted by everyone. Jackson's men approach him, but Jackson and Clay are enemies. Jackson has called Clay a gambler and a blackleg. Crawford is an invalid. That leaves Adams. The tension is unbearable. Adams notes in his diary that he is sleeping poorly. He swims in the Potomac in the freezing December water, trying to numb his nerves. He knows what he must do. He knows he has to descend from his pedestal and play the game. The night of January 9th, 1825, a carriage pulls up to the Adams residence. A man steps out wrapped in a cloak. It is Henry Clay. He enters Adams's study. The door closes. What happened in that room? We have no transcript, no witnesses. Adams's diary entry for that night is maddeningly brief, almost redacted in its vagueness. But we can reconstruct the scene, the fireplace crackling. 2 brilliant men, exhausted, wary, circling each other. They talk for hours. They discuss the future of the country. They realize that despite their personal differences, their politics are identical. They both want a strong federal government. They both want internal improvements. They both fear Andrew Jackson as a tyrant in the making. And then the unspoken offer, the bargain. It likely wasn't a written contract signed in blood. It didn't need to be. It was a gentleman's understanding. Clay would deliver the house to Adams. In return, Adams would appoint Clay as Secretary of State. Why state? Because in 1825, the Secretary of State is the heir apparent. Jefferson had been state. Madison had been state. Monroe had been state. Adams was state. By giving Clay the State Department, Adams was effectively naming him the next president. It was a cold, calculated political transaction. To Adams, it was a necessary evil to save the Republic from Jackson. To Clay, it was the only path to power. To the rest of the country, it looked like a theft. On February 9th, 1825, the day of the vote arrived. A snowstorm blankets the city. Inside the Capitol, the galleries are packed. The tension is so thick you could choke on it. The voting is by state. 13 states are needed for a majority. Adams has the support of New England. Jackson has the South and West. It all comes down to New York. The New York delegation is split down the middle. If they deadlock, Adams loses. And here, history turns on the trembling hand of a single old man, Stephen Van Rensselaer. He is a billionaire patroon, a devout, anxious man who is terrified of making the wrong decision. He enters the chamber unsure of how to vote. He bows his head in prayer, asking God for a sign. When he opens his eyes, he sees a piece of paper on the floor. It is a ballot with the name John Quincy Adams written on it. He takes it as a divine signal. He casts his vote for Adams. New York swings to Adams. The gavel falls. John Quincy Adams is elected the 6th President of the United States. It is done. He has achieved the dream. He has fulfilled the prophecy of his mother. He has equaled his father. But there is no cheering in the streets. There is only a sullen, stunned silence. When the news reaches Andrew Jackson, the general's face turns a terrifying shade of purple. He roars. He calls Clay the Judas of the West. He calls Adams a usurper who has thwarted the will of the people through backroom corruption. The corrupt bargain becomes the rallying cry of the opposition. It is the birth of the Democratic Party as we know it. It is the beginning of the end for Adams before he has even started. The inauguration on March 4th, 1825, is a funeral. Adams wears a suit of black homespun wool. He looks more like a mourner than a victor. He places his hand not on a Bible, but on a book of constitutional law, a telling detail. He swears his oath to the law, not to the spirit of the nation. He walks into the White House, the house his father was voted out of, the house he has spent his entire life marching toward. He enters the empty, echoing halls. He is the president. He has the title. He has the power. But as he sits at his desk that first night, listening to the wind rattle the window panes, John Quincy Adams realizes the terrible truth. He has won the office, but he has lost the country. The corrupt bargain hangs over his head like the sword of Damocles. He is a minority president, a leader without a mandate, a man who owes his throne to a gambler. He opens his diary. He dips his pen in the ink. He writes, "The sun of my political life sets in the deepest gloom. The machine has won. The man is broken. And outside the gates, the common man is sharpening his pitchforks, waiting for 1828. The nightmare of the presidency has begun. The White House, March 1825. It is not a home. It is a tomb. The plaster is damp. The furniture is sparse and rotting. The East Room, the great ceremonial hall of the nation, is unfinished, a cavernous echoing void where the First Lady, Louisa Catherine Adams, hangs her laundry to dry on rainy days. This is the stage for the presidency of John Quincy Adams. He enters the office with the most ambitious agenda in American history, and he enters it as a dead man walking. The corrupt bargain has poisoned the well before he has even taken a sip. He sits at his desk, the same desk where his father sat for a single term, and he feels the ghosts closing in. The silence in the executive mansion is deafening. Outside, the Jacksonians are screaming for blood. Inside, the president is screaming at himself. The sheer magnitude of the unfolding tragedy is best revealed by the vision he brought with him. In his first annual message to Congress, Adams proposes a program so forward-thinking, so scientifically advanced, that it sounds like science fiction to the rustic farmers and plantation owners of 1825. He proposes a national university. He proposes a naval academy. He proposes a standardized system of weights and measures. He proposes a vast network of federally funded roads and canals to bind the Union together. And, most infamously, he proposes the construction of astronomical observatories, which he poetically calls lighthouses of the skies. The reaction is catastrophic. Congress does not applaud. They laugh, they sneer. To the Jacksonians, this is not progress. It is tyranny. It is a federal power grab designed to tax the common man to pay for the hobbies of the elite. Lighthouses of the skies? They mock. The man is mad. He wants to look at stars while we are trying to grow corn. They block everything, every bill, every appointment, every dime of funding. Adams is paralyzed. He is the smartest man in the hemisphere, holding the most powerful office in the land, and he cannot even hire a secretary without a fight. The presidency becomes a 4-year siege. And this is where the eccentricity begins to fester. This is where the pressure of the office, combined with his own rigid, tortured psychology, begins to crack the porcelain shell of his composure. We see the emergence of the naked president. The legend of John Quincy Adams as a madman begins with a reptile. In the summer of 1825, the Marquis de Lafayette, the aging hero of the American Revolution, returns for a farewell tour. He brings gifts. One of them is a live alligator. It is a bizarre, snapping, prehistoric beast, a creature of the swamp. And where does the President of the United States put it? In the East Room, the same room where his wife dries the laundry. For several months, the alligator lives in a tub in the White House. The story goes that Adams used the beast to terrorize guests, leading them into the room and laughing as they shrieked in horror. This is the myth. The reality is far more depressing. Adams did not use the alligator for pranks. He simply didn't know what else to do with it. He was a man who could negotiate treaties with empires, but could not figure out the logistics of a pet. The alligator became a symbol of his administration, a dangerous, out-of-place creature trapped in a house that wasn't ready for it. The press, fueled by Jackson's attack dogs, spun the story. They painted Adams as a decadent monarchist who turned the people's house into a royal menagerie. They said he was out of touch. They said he was strange. And they were right, but for the wrong reasons. Then came the Mole People. In 1818, a former Army captain named John Cleves Sims Jr. began touring the country with a theory that the Earth was hollow. He believed the planet consisted of 5 concentric spheres, accessible through massive holes at the North and South poles. He believed a race of people lived inside, in a warm subterranean paradise. He wanted funding for an expedition to find the entrance. It was pseudoscience of the highest order. John Quincy Adams, the man of the Enlightenment, should have dismissed it out of hand. But he didn't. He granted Sims an audience. He listened. Why? Because Adams was desperate. He was desperate for a win. He was desperate to advance the cause of science, any science. He didn't necessarily believe in the Mole People, but he believed in exploration. He believed that if the United States sent a naval expedition to the South Pole, they might not find the hole, but they would find something. New islands, new currents, new knowledge. He wanted to be the patron of discovery. The opposition destroyed him for it. They ridiculed him in the newspapers. The president wants to spend your tax dollars to find the Mole People, they screamed. He is looking for voters in the center of the earth because he can't find any on the surface. It was a brutal, effective political assassination. Adams, the man who wanted to build lighthouses of the skies, was dragged down into the mud of the hollow earth. He retreated further into his shell, and then he retreated into the river. The image is indelible. It is the defining visual of his presidency. 5 a.m. The dawn is just breaking over the Potomac. The river is dark, sluggish, and filled with the sewage of the city. A short, stout, bald man, the leader of the free world, walks to the bank near the Tiber Creek inlet. He strips off his clothes, his black coat, his breeches, his silk stockings, and leaves them in a pile on a rock. He is 58 years old. His body is failing him. His eyes are weak. His hands shake, but he dives in. He swims for an hour. He battles the current. He treads water. This is not recreation. It is exorcism. Adams writes in his diary that he swims for his health, to cure the humors and the bile that plague his digestion. But a psychologist would tell you he was swimming to feel something other than the crushing weight of failure. In the water, he was not the minority president. He was not the son of John Adams. He was just a body fighting a current. It was a ritual of purification. He was washing away the filth of Washington politics in the filth of the Washington River. There is a terrifying story from one of these mornings. Adams was swimming with his servant Antoine. The boat they were using began to leak. It filled with water and capsized. The President of the United States, naked and exhausted, was thrown into the deep channel. The boat sank. Antoine managed to swim to shore, but Adams struggled. The current dragged him down. His heavy, waterlogged body began to fail. He gasped for air. His sleeves, he was wearing a loose swimming gown that day, weighing him down. He barely, just barely, managed to claw his way to the bank. He lay there on the mud, panting, half drowned, the sun beating down on his bare skin. He had almost died. The vice president would have taken over. The country would have been thrown into chaos. And what did he do? He got dressed. He walked back to the White House. He sat at his desk. He wrote in his diary, "I returned home quite exhausted and found the sun unfolded." He told no one. He went back to work. The man was indestructible, and yet he was constantly destroying himself. The famous story of Anne Royal, the muck-raking journalist who supposedly sat on his clothes until he gave her an interview, is likely a fabrication, a myth created later to illustrate his vulnerability. But the fact that people believed it tells us everything. The public saw their president as a man exposed, a man stripped of his dignity, a man who was literally naked before his enemies, and his enemies were legion. In 1826, the silence of the White House was broken by a message from Quincy, Massachusetts. His father, the Lion of the Revolution, John Adams, was dying. It was July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. In a coincidence so staggering that it feels like divine intervention, Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, hours earlier. John Adams's last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing his old friend was already gone. John Quincy rushed north, but he arrived too late. The patriarch was dead. The Atlas of Independence had fallen. For any other man, this would be a time of mourning. For John Quincy Adams, it was a moment of terrifying liberation and crushing burden. He was now the head of the family. The voice that had guided him, pushed him, and criticized him for 50 years was silent. He was alone. The corrupt bargain had already delegitimized his presidency, and now the death of the founders seemed to signal the end of an era of virtue. He felt as if the moral compass of the nation had shattered, leaving him as the sole custodian of the shard. He returned to Washington a changed man. He became darker, more rigid. He stopped trying to compromise. If the country wanted to go to hell with Andrew Jackson, he would not stop them, but he would not join them. The election of 1828 approached. It wasn't an election, it was a civil war fought with ink and bile. It is widely considered the dirtiest campaign in American history. The Jacksonians didn't just attack Adams's policies, they attacked his soul. They accused him of being a Sabbath breaker for traveling on Sundays. They accused him of using public money to buy gaming furniture for the White House. The gaming furniture in question? A billiard table and a chess set. Adams had paid for them with his own money, but the facts didn't matter. To the pious rural voters, a billiard table was a gateway to hell, a symbol of aristocratic vice. But the lowest blow came from his time in Russia. The Jackson Press published a story accusing Adams of procuring a young American girl for the sexual pleasure of Tsar Alexander I in exchange for political favors. They called him a pimp. They called him the pimp of the coalition. The psychological impact of such an accusation was devastating. John Quincy Adams, the most moral, the most puritanical, the most sexually repressed man in America, a man who had sacrificed his own true love for duty, a man who read the Bible every morning in the original Greek, being accused of being a pimp. It broke something in him. It wasn't just an insult. It was a violation of his identity. Louisa, reading the newspapers in the darkened rooms of the White House, wept until she vomited. The campaign destroyed her health. She wrote, "There is nothing to live for." Adams refused to fight back. He refused to campaign. He refused to dignify the accusations with a response. He believed that the people would see the truth. He believed that virtue was its own defense. He was wrong. November 1828. The landslide? Andrew Jackson, 178 electoral votes. John Quincy Adams, 83 electoral votes. It was a slaughter. The people had spoken and they had screamed no. They chose the gambler, the duelist, the executioner. They chose the barbarian. Adams was not just defeated, he was repudiated. The country had looked at his vision of a modern, scientific, industrial empire and spat on it. The last days of his presidency were a slow funeral march. He packed his books. He packed his diary. He packed the billiard table that had caused so much trouble. He walked through the empty rooms of the White House, checking the inventory list. He was leaving the house in better condition than he found it, but he was leaving the country in the hands of a man he considered a dangerous demagogue. On March 3rd, 1829, the day before Jackson's inauguration, John Quincy Adams did something that only his father had done before him. He refused to attend the ceremony. He refused to ride in the carriage with Jackson. He refused to shake the hand of the man whose supporters had branded his wife a woman of low virtue and him a procurer for foreign kings. He left the White House quietly, slipping out the back door. He moved into a rented house on Meridian Hill. He was 61 years old. He was unemployed. He was hated. He was, in his own mind, a total failure. He sat down at his desk in the rented house. The silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of the grave. He picked up his pen. He wrote, "My whole life has been a succession of disappointments. I can scarcely recollect a single instance of success in anything that I ever undertook. The man who negotiated the Treaty of Ghent, the man who wrote the Monroe Doctrine, the man who acquired Florida, the man who had been a professor, a senator, a secretary of state, and a president. He looked back at his life and saw only ash. He prepared to die. He told his family he expected to live only a few months. He stopped swimming. He sat in his chair staring at the wall, waiting for the end. The naked president was finally clothed in the shroud of his own misery. The year is 1830, and the silence in Quincy, Massachusetts is heavy enough to crush a man's soul. In a drafty, book-lined study that smells of old paper and wood smoke, a 63-year-old man sits surrounded by the wreckage of a colossal career. He is John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, the son of a founding father, the diplomat who redrew the map of the world, and now the most hated man in America. He is preparing to die. He has spent the last year in a state of funereal quiet, cataloging his library with the obsessive precision of a monk, planting trees in his garden that he bitterly remarks he will never see grow to maturity, and writing poetry about the inevitability of the grave. His political life is over. His reputation is in tatters, and the Jacksonian Democrats in Washington are systematically dismantling everything he built. The American system of roads and canals is being unfunded. The lighthouses of the skies have become a national punchline, and the vision of a unified scientific empire is being replaced by the raw populist hunger for land and gold. To the world, John Quincy Adams is a relic, a living ghost of a bygone era who has outlived his usefulness and should have the decency to fade away into the history books. He sits at his desk, his hand shaking with a familial tremor, believing that the final chapter of his life has been written in the ink of failure. But the silence of the library is broken by a knock at the door that will change the course of American history. It is not a delegation of high-powered political brokers from Washington or envoys from foreign courts. It is a group of neighbors. These are local men, farmers and merchants from the Plymouth district, people who have known the Adams family for generations and seen them rise to the highest peaks of power. They come with a proposal so strange, so unprecedented and almost so insulting that it seems like a cruel joke. They want to know if the former president of the United States, the man who dined with czars and kings and negotiated the peace of nations, would demean himself to run for a seat in the House of Representatives. In the 19th century, this move was viewed not merely as a step down, but as a plummet off a cliff. The House was considered a rowdy, chaotic pit of local squabbles, beneath the dignity of a senator, let alone a former head of state. His family is horrified by the idea. His son, Charles Francis Adams, begs him to refuse, arguing that it is a degradation of the presidency itself, a humiliation that will expose the family to further ridicule from their enemies, who will see it as the desperate grasping of an old man who cannot let go of power. John Quincy Adams listens to their arguments, looks at his books, and then looks at the empty horizon of his remaining years. For the first time since his humiliating defeat in 1828, the old cold fire ignites in his eyes. He realizes that the presidency was a cage of compromise where he had to represent every citizen, but a seat in the House offers something the White House never could: total liberation. He tells the delegation that no person could be degraded by serving the people as a representative in Congress, nor would an ex-president be degraded by serving as a selectman of his town if elected thereto by the people. He accepts the nomination, but he sets one terrifying condition that the local men must accept. He will be bound by no party and no pledges. He will not campaign, and he will vote his conscience and his conscience alone. He is elected by a landslide, not because he is loved, but because he is Adams. And in December 1831, he walks back into the Capitol building not as a ruler, but as a gladiator entering the arena for the final fight of his life. The arena he steps into is not a place of civil debate or high-minded philosophy. The House of Representatives in the 1830s is a bear pit, a violent, loud, and dangerous zoo where the tensions of a fracturing nation are boiling over. Representatives carry Bowie knives and pistols onto the floor. They chew tobacco and spit on the carpets until the floor is slick with brown slime, and they settle disputes with duels as often as with votes. Dominating this chaotic chamber is the slave power, the solid block of Southern representatives who control the Democratic Party and by extension the federal government. For decades, there has been a gentleman's agreement in Washington that slavery, the peculiar institution, is the third rail of American politics. Everyone knows it exists. Everyone knows it is the rot at the foundation of the republic. But to mention it on the floor of Congress is considered treason against the Union. John Quincy Adams, the short, bald, shaking old man with the watery eyes, takes his seat in the back row, and the other congressmen stare at him with a mixture of pity and contempt, whispering that the old lunatic is pathetic for returning to the scene of his disgrace. They think he is harmless. They are wrong. They have not let a harmless old man into the building. They have let a wolf into the henhouse. Adams decides to touch the rail that everyone else fears. He does not start his crusade as a radical abolitionist. He is too much of a constitutionalist for that, but rather as a defender of the First Amendment and the right of petition. The Constitution explicitly states that any citizen can petition the government for a redress of grievances, and the petitions are coming in by the thousands. They come from women's groups in New England, from Quakers, from religious organizations, all praying for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. Most congressmen treat these petitions as nuisance mail, throwing them in the trash or ignoring them completely. Adams reads them. He brings them to the floor. At first it is a trickle. He stands up, his voice trembling with age, and presents a petition from women in Plymouth, only to be shouted down by the Southern representatives who demand he sit down. But Adams doesn't sit down. He has another petition and another and another. The South panics, realizing that if Adams keeps this up, the entire legislative session will be consumed by the one subject they are terrified to discuss. In 1836, they make a fatal mistake. They pass the Pinckney Resolution, infamously known as the gag rule, which mandates that all petitions relating to slavery are to be automatically tabled without being read, printed, or debated. It is a complete ban on the subject, a violation of the Constitution so flagrant that it transforms Adams from a nuisance into a revolutionary. When the roll is called to vote on the gag rule and Adams's name is called, he does not answer yea or nay like a well-behaved politician. He stands up and screams that he holds the resolution to be a direct violation of the Constitution of the United States, the rules of this House, and the rights of his constituents. The Speaker screams for order. The Southerners shout him down, but the war has begun. For the next 8 years, Adams wages a one-man guerrilla campaign against the gag rule, becoming the hellhound of abolition. He uses every trick in his vast mental library of parliamentary procedure, exploiting every loophole in the rules. If he is forbidden from reading a petition about slavery, he reads a petition about the rights of man. If they stop that, he reads a petition about the horse trade that just happens to mention slavery in the footnotes. He baits them, he taunts them, he drives the Southern congressmen into fits of apoplectic rage, reveling in the chaos he creates. He is no longer the failed president who couldn't hire a secretary. He is the most dangerous man in Washington. The fury that drove this 60-year-old man was fueled by personal tragedy. In 1829, just as he was leaving the White House in disgrace, his eldest son, George Washington Adams, disappeared. George was the heir, the one Adams had pinned his hopes on, the one he had molded to carry the torch of the dynasty. But George was not a titan. He was a fragile human being who had been crushed by the weight of being an Adams. He was an alcoholic, he was depressed, he had fathered an illegitimate child, and he was terrified of his father's judgment. On a steamboat journey from Providence to New York, George began to hallucinate, hearing the engines talking to him and birds mocking him, and in a fit of delirium, he climbed over the railing and threw himself into the icy waters of the Long Island Sound. His body washed up weeks later. John Quincy Adams was devastated, writing in his diary that he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He blamed himself. He knew deep down that his coldness, his rigid expectations, his machine-like parenting had destroyed his son just as his parents had tried to destroy him. The guilt is a physical weight that he carries into the house every day. He feels he has failed as a father just as he failed as a president, and he has nothing left to lose. He has no political future to protect, no dynasty to build, no reputation to salvage. All he has is the truth, and he decides to weaponize it. He will atone for his son's death by dying for the sins of the nation. This madness becomes his shield and his sword. The Southern press dubs him the madman of Massachusetts, claiming he is senile or demonic. A young reporter named Charles Dickens visits the house and describes Adams as a terrifying figure, a man who has no friends and wants none, standing alone, fighting a battle that no one else dares to fight. His behavior on the floor is bizarre and brilliant. He develops a high-pitched, piercing voice that cuts through the din of the chamber, and though his hands shake uncontrollably with a familial tremor, When he speaks, the shaking stops and his hand becomes a rigid claw, pointing accusingly at the slaveholders. He has a photographic memory, recalling votes from 20 years ago to catch his opponents in lies, and quoting the Bible, Shakespeare, and the Constitution in the same breath. The climax of his madness comes in 1837 with the Petition of the Slaves incident, a moment of tactical genius that humiliates the entire South. Adams stands up with a mischievous glint in his eye and tells the speaker he has a petition from 22 people who claim to be slaves, asking for a clarification on whether the gag rule applies to petitions from slaves. The House explodes into pandemonium. The idea that a slave, property, a chattel, a thing, could petition the United States Congress is a direct attack on the legal structure of slavery. Congressman Dixon Lewis of Alabama, a man weighing 400 pounds, heaves himself out of his chair and screams that this is treason, demanding Adams be expelled and the petition burned. They spend days trying to censure Adams, accusing him of inciting insurrection, threatening to put him on trial. Adams waits until they have exhausted themselves with rage, waits until they have gone on record saying that slaves are not human beings, and then he springs the trap. He calmly reveals the content of the petition. The slaves were not petitioning for freedom, but were petitioning for Adams to stop fighting slavery. It was a hoax likely written by a slave owner to trick him, but Adams turned the hoax into a sledgehammer. He tells them that he did not present the petition, he only asked if he could, and by their reaction, by their desire to burn the paper, they have admitted to the world that they fear the voice of a slave more than they fear the wrath of God. He destroys them. The censure motion fails. He has made the House of Representatives look like fools and expose the moral rot of the South on the national stage. From that moment on, he is untouchable. He receives death threats daily, letters promising to cut out his tongue, which he pastes into his diary under the caption, Miscellany. He walks the streets of Washington alone, refusing a bodyguard, telling those who ask if he fears assassination that the only thing he fears is dying before he has spoken all his mind. But the toll is immense. By 1840, his health is failing. He suffers from violent coughing fits that leave him gasping for air on the floor of the house. His eyes are so bad, he can barely read the petitions he presents, forcing him to hold the papers inches from his face. He is a ghost haunting the Capitol, a man held together by pure willpower and rage, and yet he is happier than he has ever been. For the first time in his life, the machine is doing exactly what it was built to do. He is fighting a war for the soul of America, writing in his diary that he is fighting a battle for the human race. But there is one final battle waiting for him, a battle that will require not just parliamentary tricks, but the full weight of his legal genius, a battle that will take him from the chaotic floor of the House to the hushed sacred chamber of the Supreme Court. News arrives from the coast of Long Island that a Spanish schooner, the La Amistad, has been captured. On board are 53 Africans who have mutinied, killed their captors, and are demanding to be returned home. The Spanish government demands their return to face execution, and the American president, Martin Van Buren, wants to give them back to avoid a diplomatic crisis. The abolitionists are desperate for a lawyer who knows international law, who knows the treaties with Spain, who is fearless, and who is a little bit mad. They come to John Quincy Adams. He is 73 years old. He is half blind. He hasn't argued a case in court in 30 years. He looks at the request, thinks of his mother's letters, thoughts of his dead son, thoughts of the mole people and the alligator and the years of swimming in the filth. He realizes that everything, every tragedy, every failure, every lonely hour in the library has been preparation for this moment. He picks up his pen and writes back, "I will do it." The madman is going to the Supreme Court, and he is going to put America on trial. The madman was going to the Supreme Court, and he was going to put America on trial. The court in the year 1841 was not the marble temple of justice we know today. It was a dark, cramped chamber located in the basement of the Capitol, smelling of damp stone and old parchment. Into this gloom walked a 73-year-old man who looked less like a legal titan and more like a ruin of history. John Quincy Adams was shaking. His hands trembled so violently that he could barely hold his notes. His eyesight was failing to the point where the faces of the justices were mere blurs, and his voice, once the terrifying clarion of the House, was raspy with age and exhaustion. He had not argued a case before the Supreme Court in 32 years. He was there to defend 53 Africans who had been found on the schooner La Amistad. Men who had risen up in the darkness of the Caribbean, killed their captors, and tried to sail back to the sunrise of their home. The Spanish Empire demanded their return to Havana to face the firing squad, or the garrote. The American government, led by President Martin Van Buren, was terrified of offending Spain and the slave-holding South, and was actively conspiring to hand them over. The Africans had no money, no citizenship, and no rights that a white man was bound to respect. All they had was Old Man Eloquent. When Adams rose to speak on February 24th, 1841, the room went deathly silent. The gallery was packed with the elite of Washington, men and women who had come to watch the final performance of a dying lion. They expected a legal argument. What they got was a moral autopsy of the United States. Adams spoke for a staggering 8.5 hours over 2 days. He did not simply cite maritime law or treaties. He put the very soul of the nation on trial. He pointed a shaking finger at the portrait of George Washington hanging on the wall and invoked the Declaration of Independence, asking how a nation founded on the premise that all men are created equal could actively collude to send free men back into chains. He dismantled the government's case with a savagery that shocked the justices. He accused the executive branch of executive usurpation, of bowing the knee to foreign tyrants, of turning the American eagle into a vulture. At one point, in a moment of transcendent theater, he looked at the justices, men he had known for decades, men who were themselves old and nearing the end, and he spoke to them not as judges, but as mortals. "Where are the justices before whom I argued 30 years ago?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Gone to their account." It was a terrifying reminder that they, too, would soon stand before a higher court, a court where political expediency held no sway. When the verdict came down, it was a thunderclap. The Africans were free. They were not property. They were men who had exercised their natural right to self-defense. It was the greatest victory of John Quincy Adams's life. The man who had failed to save his presidency, who had failed to save his own son from the demons of depression, had saved 53 strangers. He wrote in his diary that night, "The captives are free." The exclamation point is rare in his writing. It marks a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. For the first time in his life, the machine had not just functioned, it had felt. The corrupt bargain was finally expiated. He had used the law not to seize power, but to liberate the powerless. But the story does not end with a fade to black in the Supreme Court. There were still 7 years left in the hourglass, and John Quincy Adams intended to use every grain. After the Amistad, he was no longer just a congressman. He was a living legend, a celebrity who was stopped in the street by people wanting to touch his coat. In 1843, he took a journey to the west, to Ohio and New York, and was met by crowds that rivaled those of a rock star. People wept when they saw him. They held up their children to see the Defender. For a man who had spent his entire life believing he was unloved, that he was a social incompetent, incapable of connecting with the masses, this late adulation was bewildering. He didn't trust it. He wrote in his diary that popularity was sweet, but fickle as the wind. He remained the grim guardian, the watchman on the wall who refused to sleep, and the enemy never slept. In 1844, Adams achieved another impossible victory, the repeal of the gag rule. After 8 years of screaming, maneuvering, and enduring death threats, the House finally broke. The southern wall crumbled. The rule was rescinded. Adams had won the right for the people to petition their government. It was a triumph of sheer attrition. He had simply outlasted them. He had been the rock that the waves broke against until the ocean got tired. But even then, he did not rest. A new monster was rising on the horizon, the Mexican-American War. In 1846, President James K. Polk, a protege of Adams's old nemesis Andrew Jackson, manufactured a war with Mexico to seize California in the Southwest. To the rest of the country, it was manifest destiny, a glorious expansion of the American dream. To John Quincy Adams, it was a crime. He saw it clearly as a conspiracy to expand the territory of slavery, to carve new slave states out of conquered land. When the vote for war came to the House floor and the yeas roared like a landslide, a single high-pitched voice cried out, "No!" It was Adams. He was one of only 14 dissenting votes. He was called a traitor. He was called a Mexican sympathizer. He didn't care. He knew that this war would lead inevitably to a civil war. He prophesied it. He told them that they were marching toward a precipice, that the blood of the Mexicans would eventually be paid for with the blood of Americans. He was, as always, right. He was, as always, ignored. By 1848, the physical toll of this 60-year war against the world was undeniable. Adams was 80 years old. He had suffered a minor stroke that had left him with a limp and a slur, but he forced himself to recover. He refused to retire. His family begged him to stop, to spend his final days in the garden at Quincy. He refused. "I shall die in the harness," he told them. The Capitol was his home. The floor of the House was his battlefield. To leave it was to die anyway. He was a creature of the state, manufactured for service, and he would serve until the gears ground to a halt. There is a haunting image from this period, literally. In the 1840s, the new technology of photography, the daguerreotype, was emerging. John Quincy Adams became the first U.S. president to have his photograph taken. Look at those images. You do not see a kindly grandfather. You see a force of nature trapped in a failing body. You see the bald dome, the wild white sideburns, the mouth set in a grim line of eternal disapproval. But mostly you see the eyes. They are the eyes of the boy on the boat in 1778, the eyes of the diplomat in Russia, the eyes of the naked swimmer in the Potomac. They are eyes that have seen the vanity of power and the cruelty of man, and yet refuse to look away. He looks directly at the lens, directly at us across nearly 2 centuries, with a gaze that demands to know if we have kept the Republic. February 21st, 1848, a Monday. The air in Washington is crisp and cold. Adams wakes at his usual hour, reads his Bible, and goes to the Capitol. He enters the House chamber. He is frail, his skin like parchment, but he is at his desk. The business of the day is a vote to award medals to the generals of the Mexican War. It is a vote to honor the very conflict Adams despises. The speaker calls for the yeas, a chorus of approval. The speaker calls for the nays. Adams rises. He intends to shout his defiance one last time. He intends to vote no. His face flushes red. His hand grips the desk. He opens his mouth to speak, but no sound comes out. The blood rushes to his brain. He stumbles. His right hand clutches at the air, grasping for something that isn't there. He pitches forward. Mr. Adams is dying, someone screams. The house erupts into chaos. Congressmen rush to him. They catch him before he hits the floor. They carry him not to a hospital but to the speaker's room, just off the floor of the house. It is a fitting irony. He dies not in a bed, but in the Capitol. He dies in the very building where he was declared president by a corrupt bargain and where he redeemed himself as a madman. He lingers for 2 days. He lies on a sofa, drifting in and out of consciousness. The great mind, the library of 14,000 pages, the archive of the nation, is shutting down. On the evening of February 23rd, he opens his eyes one last time. He looks at the men surrounding him. He whispers, barely audible, "This is the last of earth. I am content. I am content." It is the most shocking thing he ever said. This was a man who was never content. He was a man of misery and gloom, a man who constantly berated himself for not working harder, not being smarter, not being better. Why, at the very end, was he content? Perhaps because the noise finally stopped. Perhaps because the machine could finally power down. Or perhaps because he knew, with the clarity of the dying, that he had won. He had lost the presidency, yes. He had lost the popular vote. He had lost his son, but he had kept his soul. He had carried the torch of the revolution through the dark winter of the Jacksonian era and handed it off to the next generation, to men like Abraham Lincoln, who sat in the back of the house during Adams' final term, watching and learning from the old man. When he died, the silence that fell over the country was profound. Even his enemies, the men who had threatened to cut out his tongue, took off their hats. They realized that a giant had passed. They realized that the madman was actually the only sane person in the room. The final verdict on John Quincy Adams remains complex. If we judge him by the standard metrics of politics, re-election, popularity, legislation passed, he was a failure. He was a one-term president who left office hated and mocked. He was a diplomat who couldn't handle small talk. He was a father who couldn't express love. But if we judge him by the rubric of character, he is a colossus. He is the ultimate refutation of the idea that in America, the people are always right. John Quincy Adams spent his life telling the people they were wrong. He told them they were wrong about slavery. He told them they were wrong about the treatment of Native Americans. He told them they were wrong to fear science and intelligence. He was a mirror that showed the nation its own ugly reflection. And for that, the nation smashed him. He was the last Puritan, a man who believed that leadership was not a popularity contest, but a moral burden. He believed that the presidency was not a prize to be won, but a cross to be carried. His eccentricity, the swimming, the alligator, the temper, was simply the friction of a diamond trying to exist in a world made of mud. History has finally caught up to the naked president. We look back now through the lens of the Civil War that he predicted, through the lens of the civil rights movement that he pioneered, and we see the truth. The ghosts in the White House were not the demons of madness. They were the angels of his better nature, screaming to be heard. The boy on the boat in 1778, clutching his musket in the storm, never put the weapon down. He fought for 70 years. In the end, he didn't conquer the world. He did something much harder. He conquered himself. He leaves us a legacy not of stone, but of conscience, a reminder that sometimes the most patriotic act is to stand alone against the tide and say no.